Hi, this is Jason Martell and welcome to Lesson 3. Today we're going to be talking about the Mars-Earth connection and kind of going through some of the pieces of evidence that suggest we have a much longer history than we do just on the planet Earth. It looks as if there's also a connection with the closest planet to us, Mars. Whether that be the face on Mars or various pyramids that are both on Mars and on Earth, there's also the Sphinx, which has a very strong resemblance to the face. But it also appears that there's clear evidence from various ancient cultures that discuss Mars and have it equated to a place where the gods traveled to. So let's go ahead and dive into this lesson. Now, this is from the movie Stargate that kind of postulated that the Egyptian culture was actually seeded by, an alien god named Ra, and that there was an actual not a city in Egypt, but an actual planet called Abydos, where there was, ancient technology, and obviously this is an off-planet view. So it really does bring into question a lot of the pieces that we're going to be looking at here for is there a connection between, extraterrestrials visiting Earth, but also Mars in the past. Now, when we look at some of the edifices that we have here on Earth, obviously, Egypt is a great place to start. Most of the monuments that we have around the world, these megalithic monuments, have one thing in common. They're aligned to star constellations. Now, why this is a question we'll be looking into further in these ongoing lessons at Ancient School. But clearly, Giza is a great example of this connection or alignment with the heavens. Giza, we know, was kind of a lost culture as far as our modern day discovery. As you can see, when we first discovered the Sphinx in the early 1900s, it was covered by sand. And it took quite a bit of excavation to actually uncover the whole Sphinx, as well as the inner wall that is covering the Sphinx as well. And really, this is kind of what brought the whole question of the age of the Sphinx and the pyramids into more of an academic or scientific light, simply because once they uncovered all of this region, they were now exposing geologic surfaces that hadn't been exposed to the sun in possibly 10,000 years. So looking at these geologic surfaces really was going to give us a lot of understanding of the actual date and age for the Sphinx and the pyramids. Now, there's been quite a bit of controversy over the Sphinx because it's supposed to be the pharaoh Khufu, but clearly when we look at the face of Khufu compared to the Sphinx, the angular momentum of the face and actually the nose and various parts kind of don't line up to be Khufu. They look almost African in some nature, much older than what we currently think of the Egyptian culture at 2500 BC. It's very possible that the Sphinx and pyramids are much older than 10,500 BC, somewhere like 8,000 years older than we thought. Now, the reason why we can say that is, again, because of this geological evidence. Here we can see the modern view of the Sphinx, which looks very nice and clean and well kept for tourism, but it's also exposing some very interesting pieces that we didn't really have access to. Now, they've also done a considerable remake of a lot of the pieces here. You can see all these are all new bricks, just kind of keeping modern construction going with what the edifice showed maybe in its original form, because it has been badly degraded over time. The geological evidence is really striking here on this inner wall. What we clearly see is the signs of water erosion, water that was extensively draining over the sides of the wall. And this is a classic view of a surface, a rock eroded surface by water. And we see this throughout the area in the region of the Sphinx. Now, the last time that there was a great amount of rain, where the Giza Plateau was inundated by rain, was 10,000 years ago. So we know that there was 10,000 BC, which is roughly 12,000 years ago. I want to be clear on the distinction. 10,000 BC to 13,000 BC, there is postulated that there was some type of a global flood. Based on other texts from ancient cultures, that seems to be the date range for the great flood that took place in our most recent past. But again, the Longevity of Earth, 4.7 billion years. What's 10,000 years? It's nothing. So it looks like we had our Great Flood somewhere between 10 to 13,000 BC, and clearly the geological evidence is starting to support that. Now, other areas about the Sphinx and pyramids, again, resonate with this date of 10,500 BC versus 2,500 BC. One of the main things that we look at as far as the perfection of the Great Pyramid is not only its alignment on the ground, which is perfectly situated to true north-south and is literally on the most center point of all of the land masses like put together on Earth. Giza, the Great Pyramid, is literally pinpointing the exact center point of our entire landmass on Earth. So, one, they built it in a very specific location, alignment-wise, on Earth. But even more interesting, I should say, is they were able to align it to a constellation. The three pyramids from a satellite view have an exact representation of the Orion constellation. You can see the accuracy in the alignments here, but this one happens to be just slightly offset. Well, where have we seen this view before? Pretty much the Orion constellation, if you were to look up in the night sky, you'll see that it's three stars, the belt stars of Orion, perfectly aligned with the third one slightly offset. Now, this can't be by chance that using star charting software, constellation software, some of this is just downloadable for free, Redshift and such. You can plug into this various, star charting software and find out where the star is going to be in what position above me tonight, tomorrow night, a week from tonight, or 10,000 years ago. Okay, so we can run this model, and it turns out that the Orion constellation is a perfect alignment to the three pyramids of Giza in the year 10,500 BC. It's as if the pyramids were built as a terrestrial alignment to the Orion constellation. On that specific date, they fall into alignment, 10,500 BC. Now, what's also interesting to note is that the Sphinx, at that exact date of 10,500 BC, is looking east directly into the constellation of Leo. So at 10,500 BC, we have a clear alignment where the pyramids are aligning with Orion and the Sphinx is lining up with the constellation of Leo. This really has to raise a lot of questions as to why the Great Pyramids align to the constellation of Orion. Now, there are other areas off-world to what we see in similarities with the Egyptian culture and areas on Mars that have similar type of edifices, whether they be pyramids or a large sphinx-like object, or a large face, if you will. So we really have to analyze why many of the monuments around the world are aligned to star constellations, and Giza is really a great starting point because of the very prominent alignment that it has with the Orion constellation. It's easily traced. Now, we can see that this alignment with the Orion constellation seems to be ubiquitous. It's not just with Giza. In Teotihuacan in Mexico, again, we have this alignment that takes place where it appears the great pyramids that they've built actually align with certain stars matching the Orion's belt. Not only does the star constellation match with Giza and Teotihuacan, but also what appear to be some pyramids in China. So there could be more of a global connection with the Orion constellation as we uncover various sites that seem to have an astronomical marker. It's very prominent that many of these were interested in tracking the Orion constellation. Could this be an actual time of when the gods were appearing on Earth or traveling to Earth, was when these alignments took place? Or is it simply that the gods came from that vicinity, possibly that star constellation or that cluster? These are very interesting questions to look at because these alignments, again, are global. Now, again, some of these things are off the planet Earth and still are of great interest to us because what we're clearly seeing are similarities between what's happened on Mars could possibly be what's in store for Earth thousands of years down the road. And it almost seems as if civilization at some point was connected very strongly with Mars, if not a complete own civilization existing on Mars in the past that possibly then transferred here to Earth? We really don't know. But these are very interesting questions that we'll look into. And some of the evidence that you're going to see in today's lesson, again, raises a lot of questions. One, why is this information being withheld from the general public? But two, is there actually a longer history with other planets in our solar system that human civilizations or possibly extraterrestrial civilizations have been occupying? Well, we know for sure that in the region of Cydonia on Mars, we have what are clear artificial structures. Now, not only are these on what appear to be an ancient shoreline, you can see that, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Notice how all of this bright, knobby terrain seems to change in appearance and mellow out, where there's not as many visible bumps and it's a darker terrain. Well, that's because this is an ancient shoreline. Now, what's interesting about this is that all of the structures, the fort, these pyramids, these possible pyramids, this one here, all of these pyramids appear to be right on the ancient shoreline, and the face situated in a way where it's facing these objects as if it were a large structure, kind of like the Statue of Liberty or various other things that we might have as a monument that we could look out at. Let's explore that idea. Now, it's not just the face and certain objects like the pyramids that are very visible, or the city. There are actually other structures, the cliff, this crater, the tholus, various other things we now know have a geometric or a geographic and geometric connection to each other. They're aligned in certain ways that defy nature. Now, a lot of this information was brought out by Richard Hoagland in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And again, you have to understand that these aren't just random objects that happen to be near each other. There is clearly angles that repeat, mathematical constants that exist. So it's as if these buildings and structures were built to be in alignment with each other. Very similar to what we see with things on Earth, alignments that are taking place. Now, again, various calculations have been shown that even the angles and ratios and the trig functions that you can clearly see here that we use on Earth are being represented in these structures on Earth. It can't be by chance that there's this much math coming out of these structures. So, we really definitely want to take a look at the research by Richard Hoagland. He wrote a great book called The Monuments of Mars, The Monuments of Mars. You can also just buy these videos, which I highly recommend, and they kind of take you through all the pertinent information related to these alignments, which is, again, very intriguing. But, we really have to raise the question that the city and this pyramid, the face, and some of these other structures, they weren't built by chance to be in similar placement to each other. These angles just don't exist naturally without a cause. So clearly we're seeing signs of a civilization that existed on Mars, but obviously this is thousands of years ago. Maybe this is at the same time frame of what we're looking at with these alignments in Giza at 10,500 BC. There's very clear possibilities of an advanced civilization that was globally all over Earth and also possibly on Mars. Now again, when we look at these structures, you can see that people have speculated that they're actual, complex pyramids in various shapes and sizes, and that could be the case. These have been eroded over thousands of years, and so their true shape, nature, or purpose is really kind of foreign to us. But again, we're looking at structures on another planet, and obviously we can see similarities from what we have here on Earth as a living planet. The dead Mars still gives us signs that there was life. Now, let's really look at this ancient shoreline up close for a second. You can clearly see, again, what appears to be a landmass where it's all bright, knobby terrain, more of a dusty look, to this water area where it's very sedimentary looking, darker, less disturbance. the topography is very clear to what we would see here on Earth, that this slight change in topography is an actual shoreline. And the face has been situated in water so that these various structures, since we all love to live on waterfront property, would be situated perfectly to look out at this large edifice, which is, just so you know, 1,500 feet high and over a mile long on its longest side here. So it's not a small object. But the shoreline clearly exists. Here it is from just a different angle. And again, the terrain change right along where all of these objects are, there's almost like things that would lead right into the ocean. It's very clear that these objects, if they are artificial, are conveniently built right on a shoreline. And the face is situated where it's literally angled to these objects, where it would clearly be visible as an edifice of a face, a large face being seen from the shoreline. So we have to wonder if this isn't just by chance. We have to realize that the placement of these structures gives it a perfect view of this face. So there must have been some great prominence for why this face was carved. And if we look into Zecharia Sitchin's book, The Lost Book of Enki, he clearly talks about why this god was banished to the planet Mars and why his followers made this large edifice of his face. So if we want to believe the evidence, the same gods that created us in their image and after their likeness, based on the Sumerian texts, were also on Mars and were probably responsible for that Cydonia complex. When this image was first transmitted live from NASA in the 1970s, they just labeled it head, right? And they just said it's a trick of light and shadow. Clear shadow defined here because the sun's probably up at this angle. But as we've seen in the last lesson, that answer did not hold up. So I really just want to stress the point that even though this face is badly damaged, we've clearly been able to extrapolate that there's data that needs to be taken under further consideration. I mean, obviously, these are Sphinx-like characteristics. If you just looked at this, the similarities of it being lion-like, Egyptian-like, pharaonic-like, you know, some type of headdress, the winged disc, clearly visible, some type of, you know, Egyptian symbology embedded into this structure. There must be a connection between the Sphinx and pyramids in Egypt and the face and pyramids on Mars. So we will definitely explore this as the data continues to become available as a public view. We will continue to image Cydonia unless there's a huge public outcry like there was in the 90s where we literally picketed in front of NASA. No joke. They're not going to release a lot of images of these structures. But if the public is encouraged strongly enough to make an outcry, we can get further data. So please be aware of the missions that we're sending to Mars, because as you're going to see in these next few frames, there is critical information right in front of our nose. You just have to pay attention to it. ESA is one of the latest satellites that we have orbiting Mars, taking color photographs of the surface of the planet. Now, color is really a key word there. NASA has been sending probes to Mars for several decades, and we never get color images. Never. That doesn't mean that they're not taking color images. They actually image the planet in a larger spectrum of light than what our human eye can process. But I think that might be for a reason. It's almost like they don't want to show us what the human eye's perspective of scenery is like on Mars. We get these scientific views of larger spectrums of light being taken in from the camera, but it doesn't give you the visible light range that you would see if you were on the surface of the planet. Coincidentally, most of the imagery that we get from the surface of Mars, with a simple color correction done in any imaging platform for what RGB colors we would see through the human eye, turns out Mars takes on a much more different and interesting look than we've been shown. So ESA is definitely one of the satellites that's going to help us bring more clarity into the only view that we've had up to this point, which is through NASA's lens. Now, this is the point in case number one. The Gusev crater is a very specific region that we've been looking at on Mars. It looks like it's an ancient ocean or the floor of an ocean. Lots of water was passing through this area. And what we've seen in NASA photographs is this. I should have put this image first, to be honest with you. This appears in the Gusev crater. And when we first look at it, we're like, huh, are these oily streaks of liquid or some type of wind that's moved these, these streaky lines? We really don't know. And even if we zoom in on it, it doesn't really give you a lot of detail as to what you're seeing. It kind of looks like vegetation, though, like a grassy field or something. Well, turns out that when we image this same area using the ESA, that region is shown in color as being green. We have to wonder, folks, if why we're seeing in color on Mars actual what looks very clear structurally and color-wise to be vegetation. But NASA will only show us the black and white version. Please refute this information, NASA. If anyone from NASA is taking ancient school lessons, I would love to hear a blog post as to why there's only black and white data released to the public. Now, sometimes we have imagery and images that are released from NASA that show up in the Mars Global Surveyor archives or the Mars Curiosity, Mars Pathfinder, various places where you can just Google and look at the images being released by the public. These, as an interesting archival find, were actually from the Viking missions in the 70s. And again, what we see are two things of interest here. One is the fact that there's frost on the surface of Mars. That's frozen water, folks. Snow on the surface of Mars. I mean, that must be significant when talking about looking for signs of life. Obviously, water is a huge prerequisite to being able to support life. Another interesting thing is if you take a lot of these images, even from the 70s, and just do a simple color correction for what you would see as if you were actually standing on the surface as a human, the lenses in the cameras that take the photographs take a much larger spectrum of light. When we enhance those or color correct for the human eye, this is what we see on Mars. The actual color of the snow and the actual color of the sky. Much more Earth-like. Why is this being withheld? Every once in a while on a live press conference, they'll show you a color-corrected view. But this is what we normally are shown. Mars is a dead red planet. I don't think so, folks. I think all the evidence is starting to turn the other way. Mars is much more Earth-like, much more than I think we care to admit publicly right now. It might be dead as a planet that we would consider. It might still harbor life in some of these caves and things. We'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But clearly we're seeing evidence here that Mars is a lot more Earth-like than we've been shown. Now, when we look at a lot of this data, color-corrected, we can again see similar minerals and rocks that we share here on Earth, also with Mars, that when they're color-corrected, Mars again shows all the signs of being more of an Earth-like planet, from the atmosphere to the sky, again, to the minerals and lake beds and ocean beds that we're finding. And this is really a key part, is the fact that we're finding what appear to be ancient saltwater oceans that were flowing on Mars. I'm finding evidence that shows water is still flowing on Mars today, but we just haven't publicly admitted it yet. Now, some of the evidence that they've been releasing, again, this is from 2004, they do press releases saying signs of a saltwatery sea from NASA. You know, clearly we've landed in an area that is an ancient rock bed of debris, like salt and sedimentary debris. It covers these areas that shows water was freely flowing in these various parts of Mars. We see Mars still has that ice cap in the bottom. You know, the top and bottom have polar ice caps, but there's pretty good evidence to show that the water was flowing freely all over the surface of Mars, similar to what we have here on Earth. Now, when we look at various sections of this Gusev crater or other areas on Mars that they're studying, again, we see this clear evidence that there was a water flow, and they're even starting to get measurements as to how thick the water level was in various spots. And what you can see, these little dots are very clear signs of water and sedimentary debris being left in this type of a form. We see this all over the Earth as well as clearly now on Mars. What's interesting about this is not only are they looking at the fact that there's sedimentary debris, but every now and then, even in their just daily mundane scientific reporting, anomalies appear. This one that we're looking at here is very interesting because they basically said that, you know, just a little time passed, and then all of a sudden, when they looked at the imagery, this mysterious metallic, what they said looks like a jelly donut, which I think is a bad description. But this mysterious rock just appeared out of nowhere. And the only explanation they can give is that the tire, which you can see from the rover, that's the pod of it is here, the tire track might have kicked out a piece of debris when they moved it about 1 meter. But, you know, that's very unlikely. So I'm not saying that somebody put this here, and obviously it wasn't here just a little while before, but it is interesting to note that there are these anomalous things, even with their mundane scientific reporting that they're doing. They will have to acknowledge some of the anomalies that kind of show up in their footage as things progress, investigating the surface of Mars. Now, I don't know exactly what this is. It does not match any of the other debris in the area. It does not look like it's a piece of the rover or the lander in any way. So we kind of have to wonder what that is. Now, going back to, again, the evidence of water, there's so much imagery that we see on Mars that very closely resemble geologic things that we can see on Earth in comparison. I'd like to look at a few of these and show you, again, the similarities of what we see in satellite telemetry over Earth, forests and cities and lakes and such, and compare that to what we're seeing on Mars. We can clearly see that there's this ancient water flow, and to me, not only does this show significant signs that water was flowing here by the erosion, but possibly current water that's there now. I mean, is this actual signs of depth of water that we're looking at? You know, these are questions that need to be asked. Some of these photographs, I mean, they look just like a lake. What we're seeing again is a surface area of Mars that this appears to be stagnant water. Now, it might be that this ice is actually partly frozen water, but we're seeing clear signs of standing water on the surface of Mars. And the things around it, you know, they look almost like bacteria or some type of, you know, fungal growth or plant growth, bacterial growth, clearly, you know, similar to what we see here on Earth. We have to wonder if, you know, this imagery that we're seeing from the surface of Mars isn't exactly what it looks like. Actual standing water, actual plant life, not just like one little plant, but large areas of the planet covered by plants and water. Why is this being withheld from the public? These, again, are images freely available in some of the NASA archives of current footage that we're gathering from probes we're sending there. Now, if we look at the similarities, this is, again, from Google Maps, and you can see standing water and the color. And when we compare that to literally the same areas on Mars as far as, you know, landmass and how they appear, standing water, what appears to be vegetation, there has to be some coincidence beyond just chance that we're seeing very similar geology on the surface of Mars from what we have here on Earth. Now, again, a lot of these images are freely available on the NASA archives, and I'm not sure why they're not being publicly talked about, but in my opinion, this is very primitive forms of some type of, you know, plant life. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to confirm this until we're really exploring these surfaces up close, which, again, begs the question as to why there isn't a rover roving around in these areas or being splashed down into this water to look at this ancient, you know, lake of standing water that still exists. My instincts tell me that's exactly what they're doing, and the rovers that we see are just fluffing around in these deserts and dry lake beds when there's actual real research going on in the more interesting locations. Again, the surface of Mars. We see what appear to be symmetric. Now, I'm sure these could be natural. It's very possible that these are natural, eroded by sand and and wind. But even looking in there, that looks like some type of a bacterial, fungal growth or some type of vegetation growing. And this type of structure is very similar to what we see on Earth. Ancient cities that we know exist, that we can clearly see in satellite view all over the Earth, have these similarities to what we're seeing on Mars. Again, satellite imagery of Earth, views of the same type of building structure that we have, and we see these on the surface of Mars. It's almost as if these are ancient cities or possibly ancient cities that existed at one time thousands of years ago. So maybe there's not just an Egyptian Mars connection, but Incan and Mayan and Mesoamerican connections, because we really have to wonder if these aren't evidence of some type of ancient Incan city on the surface of Mars. Not discounting that these couldn't be natural phenomenon, sand and weather eroded, but again, similarities of the geography we're seeing raise a lot of questions. Now, again, some of these areas really are open for interpretation, but when we see one or two coincidences, fine. But when you get over 10 or 20, we really have to start to be a little bit more dubious about signs of evidence. Here we see what appears to be just a normal outcropping from the surface of Mars, where this geological surface was actually imaged under very high resolution. So we have very good, clear data about what we're seeing. But let's look a little closer. What we see in this one little carved area is very Egyptian-like. Could there be some ancient pharaonic symbols? I mean, if you look at this again, what we're seeing are similarities to statues in Egypt. Maybe this is a trick of light and shadow, but maybe not. All the other signs of evidence say that we should start to have a more skeptical eye, a more critical eye for these things that might be a trick of light and shadow, but maybe not. We know for a fact that the Egyptians were very astute in preparing for the afterlife, as well as travel to the stars. Their connections with the Orion constellations, various other monuments that they used to make these alignments, and clear, depictions that they did in hieroglyphic and wall reliefs, where they gave very clear and concise astronomical representations of where they were during certain time periods. In Dendera, we have this huge zodiacal representation of the sky, but a sky that appears over Egypt, thousands of years before, like 8,000 BC. They have a depiction in Dendera of what constellations were visible at like 8,000 BC. Why is that if they were existing in 2500 BC? The only answer is that they actually have a longer history of information that spans these thousands and thousands of years, or this culture existed much longer than we think, that Egyptians' pharaonic past doesn't start at 2500 BC, but extends well into the past, 13,000 BC, something like that. Now, again, some of the evidence to support this ancient Egyptian connection with the stars is some of the clear representation of what appear to be spacecraft and shuttlecraft, speeders and helicopters. These have long been refuted as hieroglyphics that were cracked off and fell away. No, don't be told improper information. The Abydos region has lots of information, from evidence of electricity in Dendera, evidence of sophisticated craft. It's very possible that they were traveling to the stars, and the evidence we see on other planets is us traveling to other stars. So it's very possible that we do have a connection between Mars and Earth, with this clear representation of a face and pyramids on Mars and the Sphinx and pyramids in Egypt. So interesting technology being represented by the Egyptians. Now, just a couple other points here. some of the other ancient cultures, the most ancient one that we had record of, which we talked about in lesson 1, the Sumerians, they had clear depictions and descriptions of how the Anunnaki were traveling between Mars and Earth. And they actually depicted, you can see here, an Anunnaki with the 7 dots of Earth. Remember the sacred number 7. If you're coming from outside our solar system in, Earth is the 7th planet. So a man from the 7th planet with our crescent moon travels on the winged disk to the planet Mars. And here's that dolphin symbol again of what we saw on Mars. Is there some connection, some watery connection between Earth and Mars in the past? Well, clearly the Anunnaki and the representation of the winged disk traveling back and forth. There's lots of evidence. The Lost Book of Enki, in Zecharia Sitchin's book, The Lost Book of Enki, he clearly describes how they used Mars as a way station. The Anunnaki mining the gold and using us to mine the gold on Earth, they would then transport the gold to Mars before it made its final pass off to the planet Nibiru. So we know that there is definitely an ancient connection, a Mars-Earth connection. These depictions of the Anunnaki, again, are very similar to what we see with the various pharaohs and winged discs carried throughout Egyptian cultures. There must have been some shared knowledge of traveling amongst the stars and a connection with some of the other planets within our own solar system. Now, what we see in some of the latest reports from NASA is that there's actual caves on Mars, and it's very possible that they're so deep that this might be the prime place, the prime location for us to discover life currently on Mars. Now, obviously, until, again, they send the probes to these interesting locations, or as human beings we get to return, we're really not going to know. So, last thing I just kind of like to point out here is, again, there might be a political reason as to why a lot of the information of certain artifacts and things that clearly suggest this Mars-Earth connection are being withheld, is because NASA does have certain protocols in place, and this has been the case since the late 50s. In the late 50s, the Brookings Institute, NASA hired the Brookings Institute to prepare a very long report about what would happen if human beings were ever to interact with extraterrestrial life, if human beings ever found evidence of extraterrestrial life, and how we would handle those in society, economic, religious, even philosophical views would all be greatly impacted by the knowledge of an extraterrestrial presence. So it's very possible that NASA, since the 50s, has just held tight to this mandate, their protocol, to quarantine this type of information and probably classify it under some random department of the Department of Defense so that it's never made public. But clearly, if anyone pays attention to what we're doing in space on just the public side, information can be learned. When we look at many of these megalithic structures that are all over the Earth, we really have to wonder, one, how they were built, and more importantly, why they were built. And as we can see here, these monuments are pretty much found all over the world. And one similarity that we see across all of these sites, whether it be in North America, South America, the European continent, China, all over the world, these pyramid structures seem to serve a certain purpose, which is they align to certain star constellations. Now, they don't always happen at the same time across the globe. It's not that simple. But what we do see is a consistency of most of these sites were astronomical outposts. Most of them align to certain star constellations that are going to repeat in a very large cycle of time that lasts 24,000 years. And that's something we'll be discussing here at Ancient School, is the precession of the equinox. Pretty much the zodiacal breakdown of the heavens into 12 constellations is for a reason. Think of it as a grand celestial clock. Most of the ancient cultures were aware of this larger cycle of time, and that's why they went to great lengths to create these astronomical outposts and monitor where they were in this larger cycle of time. This will become clearer as you take your lessons at ancient school, but let's look at some of these megalithic monuments specifically. Now, a lot of these sites, aside from their alignments off planet, on planet, the geodetic connections to where they're placed on the globe, again, is of great significance. And most of these sites, when we look up close, reveal a type of architecture we just can't duplicate today. If you look closely here at Tiwanaku, and there's Teotihuacan and Machu Picchu and Pumapunku, all of these names kind of sound familiar. There's a region called Lake Titicaca, and it turns out that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, most of these sites seem to be situated as either harbors at the ancient Lake Titicaca when its water levels were much higher, or were somehow associated with Lake Titicaca to some degree. So a lot of these sites have a similar type of naming structure, but the architecture is of great notice. You can see that a lot of these sites have the stones perfectly connected without the use of mortar. Now, one of the most infamous locations is Pumapunku. Pretty much everything that you would want to see in amazing architecture you find here at Pumapunku in these ruins. Now, this could have been some ancient harbor of Lake Titicaca thousands of years ago, but it's just amazing the type of cuts in the blocks that we see and the ability to stack these so perfectly without the use of mortar. There's only one term that really comes to mind to explain this process, and it's called vitrification. As we journey into some of these other images, I'll bring up that term again, vitrification, and we'll kind of dive into its definition. So here at Pumapunku, you can see that, we have these blocks that, again, just defy logic and size. They're, hundreds of tons. These are trilithoton stones. And we know that they were quarried from miles away and then brought to this location and carved into these intricate patterns and stacked perfectly. So we don't know how they transported the stones, and we don't know how they formed them into these intricate shapes. We do have a theory which involves that term vitrification, which I'm going to come back to. Now, again, the monuments that we see left here at Pumapunku, it's just kind of a dry desert area. As you can see, there's nothing really out there. There's no existing vegetation. This more than likely was an ancient riverbed or lake bed at one point. Now, these stones, if you were to ask the locals, who built Pumapunku, they would simply tell you that this was a place built by the gods. And it appears as if the gods, or whoever these beings were, destroyed Pumapunku for some reason which we still don't understand. They went to great lengths to literally smash it to pieces. Maybe there was some lost technology here that they didn't want us to interpret, or there could have been some ancient battle. But signs seem to point to some type of self-destruction. Now, again, a lot of these stones have a style that is just very hard to understand how it could have been done. And really what's interesting about the ability to make these types of shapes and these intricate cuts involves only one process: the ability to take these stones, some of the most hardest on the planet, granite, diorite, and they were able to melt the rock into a molten-like state, kind of like a lava, right? So now it's very pliable. It's almost like putty. Somehow the ancients were able to take advanced shapes and create them, but in a molten-like state. And the reason why we say that is, again, this term vitrification. Most of these rocks that have been cut like this or have precision-aligned edges seem to show signs of high heat. It's almost like a glass-like surface, as if you had a tray of lava and you put a razor or a sharp edge and scraped over the surface. The pattern of how that hardens and reveals the vitrification, is the term, is clearly displayed over all of these stones. Somehow they were able to make these stones into a molten-like state, and then they could press and cut them and create these intricate patterns that there's no other explanation. If we try to explain that they were using diamond-tipped saws, or had some type of advanced computer cutout system, you know, there's no way to explain this other than to say they were able to melt these stones into a lava-like state, and then it would be very easy to cut out these intricate patterns from an existing form, like a clay cut, just perfect thing. And that's exactly what we see in many of these sites is they've literally pressed out the stone. You can see it was somehow molten, like, melted away. And then what they were able to do is pour hot metal or some other type of metal here to bind the stones together. And again, these types of laser precision holes, this isn't possible with, again, some type of a laser drill perhaps, or a diamond tip saw using several drill bits. But the precision and accuracy, if we explain this by it was a lava-like state and someone just poked holes perfectly measured, that's a lot easier to create these types of markings and drills that we see. Now, some of the shapes, again, really just defy explanation. Now, it's possible that someone could have carved these out by hand, but we're talking about stone that's extremely, extremely hard. Granite, diorite, very hard stones. And to see these types of patterns, it makes it a lot more able to be palatable and understandable if we think about this becoming more of like a hot lava-like stone and someone just pressed this pattern into the lava, and then once it hardens back into a stone, we see these intricate patterns. So I think that's what we're seeing over many of these sites, because we do see this clear evidence of vitrification, what appears to be stone that's been heavily heated. Now, again, aside from the ability to carve these intricate shapes, another ability which we still haven't been able to come forth with a theory other than magic, or anti-gravitic technology that we just don't understand or where it went, but they were able to move these megalithic stones over several miles, and somehow they were able to cut them out of the ground, cut them out of these quarry sites, and lift them out to be carried away. Now that's something we still don't understand how they could have done this. It's not possible for us today to even cut out a block this big. You can see a gentleman standing on it. It's not possible for us to today even cut out a block from an existing stone that size and somehow wedge something in there that's going to lift it out. These are very complex things. You can see that this one was left at the quarry site in Baalbek, and these were stacked several miles away, which we'll show you in a minute. But you can see that the immense size of these, they were left because they cracked off, and these were several miles away from where they were eventually stacked. And you really have to wonder how they were able to move these types of stones using the most advanced heavy lift cranes that we have today on Earth. It would be almost literally impossible to move a block of what you're seeing here, this size. Now, I'm sure it can be done, but it would really be quite a feat and would take some serious artillery, tractor beds and such, and cranes and coordinating this. But some of the most recent geologists of today, people who work in stone masonry at megalithic sizes like this or in this range, really shake their head and scratch and go, I just don't know how they were doing it. And where are their tools that they were using? So it really does raise, a lot of questions. And again, I just want to point out that, these gentlemen you can see standing here, give it the proper scale. Some of these, again, weigh in excess of over 1,000 tons. We're talking about trilithoton stones when you just at 100 tons or higher. These are over 1,000 tons. So these are extremely large blocks that were somehow moved several miles and then stacked here. You can see another gentleman here as a reference. Now, in Baalbek in Lebanon, there are actually stories that go back thousands of years to biblical times when it speaks of how the gods used these locations like Baalbek as a place to descend from the heavens and also ascend into heaven. And what do they explain as seeing and hearing? Smoke and fire and thunderous sounds. It's almost like an ancient rocket pad. These stones were stacked perfectly, and then over the years, thousands of years later, cultures came and have built other monuments on top of these. But these original stones, no, there's no way that ancient man was able to move blocks like this with some technology that we can't even duplicate today. We're talking about some type of definite intervention, whether it be extraterrestrial intervention or lost knowledge intervention. One thing I'll definitely point out is consistency that I'm seeing is that all of these ancient sites display a type of technology. All of the ancient cultures reference some lost, whether they call them gods or an advanced culture that influenced all the great ones that we know of now as the ancient cultures. Egyptians, the Mayans, Toltecs, Aztecs, Sumerian. They all seem to have been influenced by some lost ancient civilization. And I don't think they were completely human, but they definitely lived here on Earth. Right now we call it Atlantis or something. All of this technology seems to be pieces of this lost ancient civilization. And they left these all over the earth. And we're just kind of scratching our head now as to why they built them and what they were for. So Baalbek in Lebanon shows amazing architecture with megalithic stones that really raise a lot of questions. You can see that a lot of these stones up here, I think I can zoom in for you, have what appear to be little holes. Maybe these were some at one point lifted into place and put there. But these are more current architecture than what we see in some of the more megalithic sites or stones in this area. But it still should be noteworthy to see that, again, the architecture and use of stone masonry, even from the ancient peoples, was very advanced. Now, many of these other sites, like Stonehenge is a classic example, really start to raise the bar, and not just the type of architecture that we see as far as megalithic stones being arranged in some intelligent way, but now we're seeing a higher level of mathematics and alignments to the summer and winter solstices, and ways to calculate the motions of the heavens based on the alignments of these stones. So again, we still have these anomaly questions as to how were they able to cut the stones of this size? How were they able to move the stones of this size? And now on top of that, why did they arrange the stones in this way? We can only lean upon our current level of science and mathematics that we understand today. What we might know 50 years or 100 years from now might change the way we look at these sites, but right now we recognize that many of these sites are geodetically placed at certain locations. Maybe they were attached to some large energy grid. We'll look at that in another slide in a minute. But looking at Stonehenge specifically, the math and the alignments here, it's not by chance. You can see that the different shadows that are hitting the ground allow for markers, kind of like as a calendar throughout the day, to mark where shadows fall at certain angles. There's also certain sight stones around the edge that allow you to align various viewpoints from whether you're standing inside or outside the circle. And you can see here that there actually are stones placed outside of the circle for further reference to mark shadows and alignments that take place as the summer and winter solstices actually align perfectly to stones and holes cut inside of Stonehenge. Now, this has to have been some type of large ancient clock. And as I mentioned earlier, many of the ancient cultures were aware of a much larger cycle of time and went to great lengths to build monuments that matched these movements of the heavens. Now, what we're seeing here is, again, a classic example of alignments that take place where, based on astronomical movements that, again, repeat over time, in some cases over thousands of years, these alignments continue to take place. It's like a grand celestial clock to understand their purpose or time, where they were in this larger cycle of time. Plato called it the great year. You hear terms like we go into the golden age and then to the dark ages. All of this information seems to be tied to this overall understanding of a larger cycle of time. So we're going to continue to bring that to surface as we go through these topics. Now again, here you can see some of the alignments actually laid out, whether it's going to actual star constellations like Sirius and the Draconis. We also have the winter and summer solstices. The actual days of the calendar are infused into these rocks in a way where it's marking these alignments that take place throughout time. You can actually see that, the equinox is perfectly aligned with being able to look at true north and south and understand that the alignments of Stonehenge are happening on our planet perfectly with true north and south, but as well as off planet to actual different star constellations, and using all of this information as some large celestial clock. Now, we see that many of the sites around the world, Stonehenge and Teotihuacan, even the Great Pyramid, Baalbek, they're all appearing on these lines, whether they be called ley lines or just geodetically coded locations. It's maybe possibly some ancient energy grid. Now, we know that there was, through Nikola Tesla's work and others, very easy to harness natural energy. And it appears these megalithic sites are built at certain latitude and longitudes that are possibly tapping into this ancient energy that just exists, whether it be through hyperdimensional physics, as some of the researchers like to call it. All of the planets and their spin are creating a vortex of energy that I think the ancients and possibly even extraterrestrials were aware of, are aware of, and use this knowledge. And that's why a lot of these sites are so fascinating, is because they contain so much information that we still have yet to understand. Now, the Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the most excellent megalithic monuments that we can continue to refer to, because not only is it built, again, perfect, true north-south, it's situated right in the middle of all of the world's landmass. And it's aligned in ways that we just can't understand, with its ability to align to the constellation of Orion in 10,500 BC. The building style of the bricks, the inner chambers of the king and queen's chamber. I mean, the king's chamber, if it was built for a king, why are there no hieroglyphics in the king's chamber? Why are there nothing inscribed on the walls, giving the great fervor of the king? What we see is an empty box, actually a box that's the exact same dimensions for the Ark of the Covenant. And all throughout Egypt, there are these depictions of what appear to be a form of an ark, some large box with two poles on each side, just like you saw in the Indiana Jones movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. That ark, that depiction is seen all throughout Egypt. It's very possible that there's a whole other story, which hopefully we'll talk about in future lessons, that Moses was actually a pharaoh of Egypt named Akhenaten. And when he left Egypt and took his people, he also took the ark, this great power source. Again, remember the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? It's killing all the Nazis with lightning bolts. They see spirits coming out of it. Well, there's a lot of information that shows to exist in saying that the pyramids were possibly large energy capacitors of some kind, or were utilizing the Ark of the Covenant, as an example, as a large energy capacitor, possibly tapping or sharing in this energy that was ubiquitous around the globe. We seem to have lost that knowledge. But the alignment still exists. The math still exists. We can look at these objects and now, just based on satellite telemetry, can do basic mathematics and look at the repeating algorithms and things that we see that aren't just by chance. There's no way that people could have just built the pyramid stone by stone, let alone the time and effort to do it, but the planning of the architecture is too perfect. These alignments, again, can be confirmed by using computer mapping software, and you can easily see when the stars are going to appear above you at night, right? So when we use Redshift or any of these programs that you can easily download for your iPad, where do I see the stars at night? You can roll that clock forward and where they're going to be ahead of you in a week, or roll that clock backward. And in 10,500 BC, the Orion constellation is a perfect match with the pyramids on the ground. The pyramids are literally forming a terrestrial map of the sky. So we have to wonder why many of these sites are built to line to a star constellation. And obviously the kicker of why this alignment is so interesting is, the pyramids were supposedly built by the Egyptians, early dynasties. We're looking at 2500 BC. That's about 4,000, 4,500 years ago, right? Because, we're 2014, so if you go to AD, BC, 2,000 years ago, that's 0. And then if you go back another 2,500 years, right, you're then at 2,500 BC, but that's 4,000 years. So whether or not the Egyptian culture is only 4,000 years, 2,500 BC, I don't think so. Why is it that these pyramids align to Orion in 10,500 BC, 8,000 years earlier? And there are wall reliefs in Dendera, Egypt. You can just Google Dendera wall reliefs. And basically, you'll see that the Dendera wall relief of the great view of our zodiacal solar system and our view of the heavens. Essentially, they have a view of the heavens with all of the star constellations that would have been in view from the ground at around 8,000 years ago, or 8,000 BC. I'd have to actually check that. I believe it's 8,000 BC. Why would they want to mark the view of the heavens from the ground at what it looked like in 8,000 BC? Either they were there or something amazing happened at that time, and they're trying to remember that by marking it with these amazing alignments. So again, the math at some of these sites, we really have to scratch our heads and wonder. And it's not just Egypt. These pyramids exist all over the earth. Obviously, when we go into South America, that's really the next big shell of information where we see advanced systems of worship that took place based on astronomical movements, knowing when there'd be a solar or lunar eclipse, just like you saw in Mel Gibson's movie Apocalypto, and the priest looked over at the king and said, "Do your thing," because he knew when the solar eclipse was going to take place. Many of these ancient sites, again, are aligned and show repeating alignments within the architecture. In South America, many of these sites really raise a lot of questions, not only because of why they were built, but what they actually signify. And all throughout South America, there are these talks of these ancient gods. What's really interesting about the whole Mayan civilization and the return of Kukulkan, or this ancient god, is they have a very advanced calendar system, and these monuments again are markers in that calendar system. And so we have to wonder if they're not trying to tell us information to say when these ancient gods will return, or at least when the ancient gods were last here, or when they were here and something momentous took place, and they've created these alignments to mark those times. Now, when we look again at the architecture at some of these sites, this one again is amazing. And some of these pyramids, the great tomb of Palenque, King Pakal, I should say, his pyramid, he literally his tomb is inside of a pyramid. And when we look at some of the architecture around how they were able to build this pyramid around his tomb, it really raises a lot of questions, let alone this infamous tab, or large tablet, I should say, that covers the tomb of Pakal and literally looks like King Pakal is flying a rocket ship. You can just Google King Pakal. These are things that I'll show in future lessons. Now, this pyramid specifically that we're going to look at here really has an interesting play that happens based on, again, an astronomical alignment, a play on light and shadow. And you can see that it's a very well-traveled tourist spot. And at several of these locations nearby, again, we see astronomical observatories, literally built out of stone as ways to go up here and have a clear view to make astronomical observations. And this was done by high priests and astronomers and recorded as sacred information. Now, what we see here is a very interesting light and shadow effect of the serpent god being memorialized by this simple shadow. The sun, literally at a certain time of the year, will hit this part of the pyramid and create this shadow effect. If you can see the serpent's mouth here, and it's literally like a snake, the serpent god coming down from the heavens. And this is memorialized, and people make great reverence to see this shadow effect and appear from all around the world. So you have to wonder how momentous this must have been even for ancient people, because even today we're in revered and awe as to how this is possible and why the ancient people memorialized their interaction with their gods. And in this case, the serpent god, whether it be Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl. There's many variations of these Hispanic gods, but they have a similar theme of being serpent gods. Also, interestingly enough, when we look at some of these gods, they're usually pale skin and either white hair or red hair. White, pale skin, red hair, and they're gods of the South American people who are all dark skin, dark hair. It's very interesting information. And they went to great lengths to memorialize these interactions with their living gods. Now, again, when we look at many of these sites, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, all of these sites across South America really raise, again, a lot of questions based on their not only size but placement. And Eric von Daniken actually theorized that the placement of all of these pyramids align with various planets that we know of in the solar system, as if they were marking on Earth the various planets known about in our solar system. But the math can't be denied. Again, we see these repeating mathematical patterns that are just too consistent for an ancient civilization to have done by chance. There was great architectural planning done into building these monuments. And as you can see, we're talking about a very grand scale. Anytime I look at this site, I always think that, boy, what if large spaceships or rocket ships were landing here or were parked here and used by the gods? I mean, this is literally the place of where man interacted with the gods. Why wouldn't there also be vehicles of the gods, chariots and such that we've seen depicted in ancient times? They had no other way to understand the conveyance of flight than to put wings on it or give it a fiery chariot in the sky. But we have a lot of depictions and sounds of the presence of these ascensions and descensions of spaceships of the gods. It's always loud, thunderous smoke and fire, just like a rocket ship. So these to me very much have a similarity to what I would say could be some type of ancient landing and launching pad. Otherwise, again, for ceremonial purposes, I can see that as well, but we have to wonder if the names being all around planets and a place where the humans met the gods, if interesting things were taking place that weren't just mythology. So again, these step pyramids, as if they're kind of making their way up to heaven. It's a repeating theme that we see throughout South America. Now, Machu Picchu, again, looking at some of these other ancient sites, again, we see mathematical almost perfection in the cut and layout of these locations. And thankfully, through the use of satellite imagery, not only can we be on location and do measurements, but we can also do these types of satellite measurements. And again, the alignments and things that we're finding really raise a lot of questions. I even have to give my hats off to NASA, who's been using a new type of synthetic aperture radar, and they've essentially equipped a large 747 with this synthetic aperture radar, and they can fly over locations like this, and they use this ground penetrating radar, synthetic aperture radar, where it can literally pierce through the layers of ground and give you views of what you're seeing in the strata. And there have been several locations where we've now discovered through this synthetic aperture radar what appear to be shrubs and bushes, pyramids, and ancient cities that are hidden from view. We're now discovering through satellite telemetry, and the use of new radar technologies. So again, whether we look at Machu Picchu from satellite or we look at it actually physically at location, we see a type of brilliance being displayed that, again, you have to wonder, why did they choose to live so high in the mountains? And how is it they had such amazing architectural knowledge to build such feats as we see at Machu Picchu? And as we dive in closer, we see that they had an ability to use stones without any masonry and create these layouts that you can only imagine a thriving civilization. I mean, it already looks very inviting in its ruined state, but with, beautiful tapestries and festivities and fruit and commerce going on, these were some pretty amazing cities. And we have to wonder where they all went. Now, this llama has a nice view. Again, the architecture and brilliance that we see displayed at some of these sites like Machu Picchu, when we get in closer and look at some of the actual architecture, we see a type of mortarless building style that, again, is very similar to what we see in Egypt, very similar to what we see across South America. This is some type of way that they were able to heat the stone into this molten-like state. And then it was very easy to stack them and push them together so that there's literally not even the ability to put a piece of paper through some of these cracks. Literally just mortarless building that will withstand, as we've seen now, thousands of years. So the only explanation for this type of style of building was heating these stones to a state of almost like lava. This one's a great example. There's no way they'd be able to do these types of intricate cuts and have everything fit perfectly, even literally creating an open area to view, like a window, if you will. But these stones don't make any sense to have been cut like this with ancient tools. The only way we can explain it is we see clear signs of heat. And if you were to actually look closer, I don't think I can do any better than to zoom in here, but it almost looks like as if once they were stacked, there were scrapes done, like literally just scrapes, where they were able to just cut these perfect incisions into the rock after they were laid in place. So it really does raise a lot of questions as to how they were able to heat stone to a degree where it was like in a molten-like state and they could just fit them together like these blocks that you see here. And some of these, again, are almost cut out like a cement press, perfect in size, over and over, just kind of coming out of like a cement truck, if you will, and then always stacked perfectly without any mortar. So we have to wonder how they were able to do this, and more specifically, why? Why did they go to such great lengths to build these intricate structures that, again, have these alignments or are in very interesting geodetic locations around the globe? Well, we seem to see a representation at many of these sites that speak of for the gods, built by the gods, a place where we interacted with the gods, a place where the gods descended or ascended from heaven, and this connection with megalithic stones. In my mind, there must be, some coincidence that's grander than just that. There's knowledge of some lost ancient culture, civilization, whether they were gods or aliens, or both, maybe not gods and aliens, maybe whether they were human or alien. I think what we're looking at is depictions of lost knowledge. All of these ancient cultures attributed to these types of gods. But I think it could have also been an advanced lost civilization, an Atlantean civilization. I want to generalize it that easily. But some great lost civilization that influenced every culture around the world and left us these monuments to wonder, how is it that the ancient Aztecs or the Mayans or the Egyptians built these? Maybe they didn't. We see a type of being depicted all around the globe at these sites. And in the next lesson, we're going to dive into this further in ancient gods. But all around the world, there's this depiction of a slender being and their hands are always wrapped at the waist. Whether it's in Turkey or in Göbekli Tepe or in Rapa Nui or even throughout South America, there's this similar depiction of this being. Maybe these were the beings influencing all the ancient cultures that we now have today. Egyptian, Mayan, Aztec, Toltec, all these ancient ones. They went to great lengths to encarve little faces and various things, either in dedication towards a god or in at least acknowledgement that there were places where gods and man interacted. And again, they always went to great lengths to build architectural monuments at these sites. Geodetic locations, part of some large energy grid, or just a coincidence that they were having interaction with their gods at these various locations. Now, some of the sites are actually underwater. Now, this is Yonaguni, and we still put into question some of these sites like Yonaguni off the coast of Japan. But clearly, if anyone actually goes to these sites, or if you look at satellite imagery of these locations, what we're seeing appears to be non-natural, very much like step pyramids and things that we see above the water. So it's very possible that there were ancient cultures that existed 10,000 BC to 50,000 BC, many, many years before we currently look at ancient cultures now, at ancient Sumer at 3800 BC. Obviously, there's evidence of ancient cultures going much further back, but we haven't uncovered a complete civilization yet. Only signs, only pieces of evidence to say that, yes, there are ancient cultures that existed on monuments above the earth, above ground, as well as even underwater. So further studies obviously need to be done at Yonaguni, and I'm sure that over time, more of these sites will be found by the use of satellite telemetry and soon to be new radar technologies that allow us to image the surface of the oceans as well, where I'm sure there's a plethora of lost monuments and technology. So one of the sites that again has come into focus is Göbekli Tepe. It's a site in Turkey with large megalithic stones with intricate animals, and again, this being is shown in Göbekli Tepe. It's sorry I don't have a picture of his face. We'll go to the next slide here in a minute, but you can see that hands always again wrapped at the waist. These slender beings. They're shown at all of these megalithic locations. I wonder if there isn't some type of lost civilization. Here again you can see Göbekli Tepe, various pillars. This was buried in the sands of time, and someone just happened to see a little stone sticking out on their property and started to uncover it. And it turns out to be this very intricate astronomical marking system with little animals and again these beings, hands wrapped at the waist. So we still don't understand what this site meant, but again it seems to be tied into this larger evidence of a great civilization that influenced everybody. Here's another pillar that we can see with some type of an animal at Göbekli Tepe. Now, another area, again, where we see these beings, hands wrapped at the waist, is in one of the most remote areas on Earth, if not the most remote. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, we have what are known as the moai, whether they be in these statue form or in these heads, what we thought were heads. It turns out that the moai heads are not just heads, they're full bodies. And again, hands are always wrapped at the waist. These are some ancient depicted being, but for some reason has been buried underground for probably thousands of years, and only the heads have been above the surface. We really have to wonder what this means. We're trying to look at some of the depictions and things that we're finding at these locations now and kind of match them up. But it really raises a lot of questions looking at these moai head and realizing now that they too are this representation of a slender being, hands wrapped at the waist. So we're definitely going to continue to look at these megalithic sites and explore why these alignments take place, and hopefully find some of the hieroglyphic and writings and things that are consistent around the globe, telling us this story of this lost ancient culture. Okay, I think that's going to probably wrap up our lesson for today. All right, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the modern search for a planet X. Now, as we discussed in last week's lesson, the ancient knowledge of a planet X or a Nibiru is clearly documented in the Sumerian texts. But the idea of this Nibiru being a planet that we're looking for in current times takes on a new slant. And so we want to look at some of the modern research and kind of understand what we're leading up to and looking for a planet that would actually meet the Sumerian descriptions of this ancient Nibiru. So one of the things to obviously look at is evidence for the Great Flood. Now, what we have are maps going back well into our history that seem to show a very accurate representation, not only of our coastline, right, but, and here's the both poles, it's a flat map, but it also shows all of the types of like animals and various things that are found on these continents. So it's a very accurate representation of an aerial view from the sky, you know, looking down at our continents. Now, no one that we knew of had the power of flight in ancient times. There was no ancient culture that was using like hot air balloons or anything of the like. So we really have to wonder what we're looking at here when we see this information about, you know, a great flood. Now, a lot of these things that relate to the idea of a great flood, we find in various ancient maps that again show the topography of our North and South Pole pretty much accurately underneath the sheets of ice. Now, this is very hard to conceive of because, one, you would need to have an aerial view to look down at the continents, and two, more importantly, you would need ground penetrating radar to know the actual land mass versus the ice and differentiate between the two. So we do have a significant amount of data that comes out of the sedimentary layers, the geological evidence, to say, yes, there appears to have been a large flood, let's say 10 to 13,000 years ago, looking at sedimentary layers, as well as the understanding that, you know, some of these ancient texts that talk about Planet X or Nibiru say that one of the large ice sheets, when Nibiru last passed by thousands of years ago, caused this great flood. So obviously we'd want to pay attention to the idea of a Nibiru or a Planet X from the standpoint that it is attached to our cosmology, forming of our planet, catastrophic changes to our planet. But to say when these things will happen again, we need to first identify the real Planet X Nibiru. Now, if we look at some of these other artifacts, again, that confirm this story of the Sumerian tale of a great flood, we have to understand that this is probably not mythological information. We can start to look at the geological evidence as well as new space data, things that we're looking at for actually looking for extrasolar planets. And to do this, we need to first understand the tools we currently have available. So it is interesting, again, to denote a lot of the information that was told to us by the Sumerians about this shining cross in the sky, the symbol for Nibiru, where the ancient gods came from. Now, if we're actually able to find this planet within our own lifetime, a planet that's 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, then we might be in for some very interesting cultural changes when we realize there's possibly another civilization living on this planet. That's what all the ancient texts tell us, is that these beings, the Anunnaki, came from this planet, Nibiru. So if we're ever actually able to find the real Nibiru, which is, again, 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, a very large planet, if we're ever able to find this planet, we might be in for some very interesting realizations that we aren't alone in the solar system. Now, again, we've looked at some of these Sumerian artifacts, and we have to realize really the main point about the Sumerian evidence is this is well before our understandings of modern technology. 6,000 years ago, this Sumerian culture has lots of evidence, which is in alignment with many other ancient cultures that speak of a time when they were visited by the gods. The difference is that they've left us so many texts and artifacts that we can now confirm with our modern science when they talk about the distance between the planets or what the planets look like in space. So when they talk about this additional planet Nibiru, we really need to take a step back and try and understand what they were trying to tell us. Now, a lot of these symbolic references that they've left us in the cylinder seals and the clay tablets, we've been able to identify what a lot of these mean. This winged disc, the symbol of Nibiru, the 7 dots of Earth representing, Earth, the 7 dots representing Earth, the sacred number 7, 7 days in a week. All of these, again, come from this base of information which was bequeathed to the Sumerians by the Anunnaki that claimed they came from this other planet, Nibiru. So when we look at a lot of these references of interactions between the Sumerians and the Anunnaki, they're giving us kind of like a pictogram overview. Just like in hieroglyphics, the Egyptians were able to use one symbol and convey maybe several words. Today we would call that an acronym, like CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, or FYI, for your information. Sometimes these symbols of the winged disc or various other pieces of this slate are meant to represent more than just one word. It's actually, a picture is worth 1,000 words, as that saying goes. So it really is interesting to take note of some of the pieces of evidence that we see over and over as hieroglyphics or pictograms shown in the Sumerian information, because a lot of the references do take on a meaning in scientific terms. We just need to unravel the meaning. A lot of that symbology that they've left us about the Anunnaki, they were commanders of a spaceport if they had this symbolic headdress. We see that they appear to be wearing watches and having, things that would almost be a technological layer. Even if ancient man didn't understand what these things were, what they saw the gods doing and using, they seem to have been very able to accurately represent a lot of the information and things that were happening in their time. And again, this symbol of Apollo 11 does make sense to us, right? We understand that we're just symbolizing the power of flight. So all of these references for winged discs or, winged beings, we have to understand that it's not mythology. Ancient man went to great lengths to convey that they had the power of flight. They were coming from the skies here. But that's not the only place they say they came from, the skies, right? Very specifically, the Anunnaki came from Nibiru, another planet within our solar system. All the astronomical data that we can confirm with our sciences today is confirming what they've said. So we should really dive into these topics. Now, as I've mentioned, many of the biblical tales, many of the Sumerian texts recorded movements of the heavens over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, as sacred astronomical data that was only handed down to the high priests. So this has been preserved, and now that our modern science is caught up to the point where our telescopes and our mathematics can calculate these vast distances, we're now starting to see that it confirms a lot of the information told to us by these ancient cultures. This one obviously is, a very infamous tale, and I think I've mentioned this in the previous lessons. The Enuma Elish, or this longer epic of creation. In the Bible there were 7 days of creation, right? In the Sumerian version we have 7 tablets of creation. And it goes into a very specific story about the cosmology of our solar system, how the planets came into being, how life and us came into being here on Earth. So it's a very interesting tale when we look at the aspects of how it explains the story of Nibiru, Planet X, how an intruder planet gets pulled in and is gravitationally attracted to the planets and has this interaction with our primitive Earth. So we must understand that, again, this information is recorded in stone. Our science today is now starting to further confirm what was written down thousands of years ago. The Sumerians were very specific in explaining that these beings, the Anunnaki, came from another planet within our own solar system, Nibiru, which stood for a glowing cross in the sky. And this, of course, was 4,000 years before Christ, Jesus on the cross. So it's very interesting information when we look at all of the astronomical data that we can now confirm that they've left to us. A lot of that information in the Sumerian pieces of Nibiru and Planet X was brought out by a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin. And now while Zecharia was an accomplished author, he was also a well-established historian and researcher, and spent many times in the field, researching this data, taking groups of people with him as well. And one of these, missions that he went on was he went and confirmed and collaborated with NASA about the Sumerian model for a Planet X and how that is in alignment with some of the current data at that time in the late 80s, early 90s for the Naval Observatory, and meeting with the lead naval astronomer. So here is actual video clip of when Zecharia Sitchin met on camera with the Dr. Harrington.
You wish to tell us in a few minutes the nature of those discoveries?
I'd be happy to, and you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, the date on here, I was just noticing, is 14 August 1978, which was just about 6 weeks after we discovered the fact that Pluto has a satellite. Once you have a satellite for a planet, you can determine how heavy it is. It turns out Pluto was very much smaller and lighter weight than we had thought, which meant that Pluto has no influence, no appreciable influence on the motions of the planets Uranus and Neptune. At that point, we voiced the hypothesis that this means that there is at least one yet to be discovered planet in the outer reaches of the solar system.
So there you have it. I mean, that's on camera, Dr. Harrington speaking with Zecharia Sitchin. And again, Dr. Harrington was the lead naval astronomer for NASA at the time. And his model, basically as a three-dimensional model, showed Nibiru, or Planet X, as he would call it, on this elongated orbit. Very similar to the Sumerians' descriptions of, again, Nibiru being on a very elongated orbit, which takes it 3,600 years to complete one cycle around our sun. Now that must mean that there might be a second sun or something else that's allowing it to loop back around, which we'll discuss later on in this lesson. But there we have on camera Zecharia Sitchin and Dr. Harrington discussing the two models for the ancient Nibiru and the modern Planet X. And this isn't new. I mean, we've had many scholars that have started to look at the various orbits of our planets pretty much right as we started to come out of the Dark Ages and back into the Renaissance age. All of this new information was being rediscovered, what was well known by the Sumerians thousands of years ago. We lost this information. We somehow forgot it as a civilization, as a culture. And now we're rediscovering it through the time of Renaissance eras and Copernicus and Galileo. It's a norm that the Earth isn't the center, it's the sun, and we orbit around the sun. Somehow the Sumerians knew all of this information accurately thousands of years ago. But the kicker is that they also described another planet, Nibiru, Planet X, which we still have yet to discover. So here again is a tablet that you can see is, again, thousands of years old, and we have the sun accurately represented in the center, and all of the planets that we currently know of in their correct size and position, but with one additional planet, Nibiru. So they counted the planets that we know of today, but they also counted one additional planet labeled X here, Planet X. And it's always, again, interesting to note that we think we're the third rock from the sun, but if you count coming outside the solar system in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, Earth is the seventh planet. So anyone coming in to our solar system from outside, right, they say, well, you're on the seventh planet. And that's why Earth is labeled Ki by the Sumerians, the seventh planet. Now, science didn't even recognize the idea of an elongated orbit, something with an egg-shaped orbit. They just didn't even have any evidence of this until in recent times when Hubble found, sure enough, not our solar system, but another planet orbiting around another star, and it has an elliptical orbit. So it started to slowly creep into the consciousness of our space sciences that these things are actually possible. A planet that could orbit our sun in a 3,600-year orbit is a scientific possibility now. Now, there has been the idea put forth too that maybe Nibiru exploded, that Planet X doesn't exist anymore. And this is because if we look at all the fragmentation on our various inner planets, even our moon is cratered by debris that has been hitting it, Mars as well. So we have to wonder if there isn't some type of large explosion that took place in the past. Well, maybe, but all the evidence to the contrary says that Nibiru does exist as a planet still intact because the Anunnaki live on this planet. Now, there was an excellent researcher named Dr. Thomas Van Flandern that wrote a book about this planet, this exploded planet hypothesis. And while I disagreed with Dr. Van Flandern, he did bring up some interesting points that should be of note. This heavy cratering of all these planets that we have in our solar system really does and should raise questions about are we in danger of threats from space, whether it be the return of Nibiru or possibly asteroids and comets. So that's something else I'm going to touch on in this lesson. But I don't think that Nibiru actually blew up. I think that in the past, as the Sumerian creation tales explain, Nibiru, the main moon of Nibiru, had this collision and caused our Earth to go into the orbit it's in now. And we'll kind of just dive into this information. But, a lot of this information that confirms the Sumerian descriptions for a Nibiru, or as we would call it, a planet X, simply because it's X unknown, but the 9 planets we know of, and then X, making it number 10, the Roman numeral 10 is an X. Even though Pluto was demoted, we're not going to even go there. So there is data to suggest that NASA has been looking for and identified the possibility of another planet within our own solar system. It started with Dr. Harrington, but he was looking at orbital perturbations. Basically, everything in our solar system, even satellites that we would launch, were being pulled in a certain direction within space. This gravitational influence couldn't be accounted for. So they said, well, there must be some large body that was once here or is in an orbit that we still haven't found that caused all these gravitational influences, and even could possibly explain some of the anomalies within our solar system. Uranus is tilted on its side. Pluto and Neptune are possibly dislodged moons of Saturn that are now in the orbit that they're at. So just a lot of these solar system anomalies were explained at the time by Dr. Harrington by saying an intruder planet, by having this intruder planet go through the inner part of our solar system, it can explain with one orbit all of the anomalies that we currently have in our solar system. Now that model has changed, and we've moved on from orbital perturbations to infrared technology, where we have super cooled telescopes sitting in space that are kept at a below freezing temperature, and then using infrared they can adjust their temperature frequency to pierce deep into space, well beyond what Hubble and some of these initial telescopes could do. And sure enough, we're starting to see a bunch of different worlds floating out there. And so that's what starts to bring up this idea that there is, in modern times, another planet within our solar system, a planet X. We're still looking for it. Now, you can see that this is a diagram from an Encyclopedia Britannica, which my father used to sell Encyclopedia Britannicas, and that's how I was raised, essentially, is my dad was a book salesman. And I remember several years ago when I found this diagram, I was amazed to know that even Encyclopedia Britannica in the 80s documented the idea that there is a 10th planet. The Pioneer 10 probe, and even the Voyager probe, but you can see the two Pioneer 10 and 11 probes in this diagram from the Encyclopedia Britannica show a 10th planet. They even show a second sun, right? This isn't new information, folks. It's not something that the scientific community can boldly accept, but understand that it is a scientific norm and has been well documented within acceptable resources. Now, the Harvard astronomical community has also been documenting and keeping note of where a planet X might be. These various Harvard abstracts show plates of the sky and marked points of where they think this Nibiru or a planet X could be located. So it is interesting, again, to look at some of the current data and search for this planet X, because, if we do actually find this planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth within our own solar system, It's time to pay attention, folks, because the game will change. Now, as I mentioned, we do have several different telescopes that we've launched into space, and some of them have some very interesting technology. One of them was originally launched recently. It was called Certif. We recently just renamed it to Spitzer after a famous astronomer that passed away. Excuse me. But the Spitzer telescope is amazing, again, because it's the most advanced infrared telescope that we have. It's able to pierce these dense layers of debris that are millions and billions of miles out in space. And since it's infrared, it can tune its temperature to the same temperature of, let's say, this debris field and pierce right through it, again, using infrared technology. So we're going to continue to launch packages into space that are going to allow us to have the capabilities to start to see deeper and deeper into the universe and have better understandings of things that are floating around in our current solar system. Right now we've detected many extrasolar planets. We've called them Xena and Quoar and Sedna, but these are all, in my opinion, just large balls of ice. 800 to 1,000 kilometers in diameter, mostly frozen surface content. Nothing 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. But I trust, folks, that the telescopes and things that we will be launching, we will clearly be able to see a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. So it is very interesting to pay attention to the type of technology that we are launching through our subconglomerate space agencies, NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, Goddard Space Center. There's about a handful of them in the US. So I definitely recommend that it is your responsibility, if you're interested in the ancient astronaut theory, to know where we've gone in the past. We also must know where we're headed in the future. So that you understand, there are several different planet classifications, and the one that we're really interested in is here, a brown dwarf. Our sun right now is a large, full of energy planetary source. But there are other classifications. Just like Jupiter is a gas giant, there are other types of suns, for instance, a brown dwarf, where it was once a very large heat-generating sun, but it's lost its energy and capacity and shrinks to a certain size. Our second sun is more than likely now a brown dwarf. Nibiru might still be orbiting around that brown dwarf and coming back towards the inner part of our solar system every 3,600 years, according to the Sumerian information. Okay, now what's really interesting to note is that we have technology spread all over the planet and in space of various types of telescopes for us to do some very accurate models of things that we're looking at in space. The Keck interferometer is great. It takes 2 independent points and looks at one specific location to create a 3D model of what they're looking at, a star or a certain area in space. But as we've seen over the last 10 years, the idea that there is something else out there, this has been coming over and over, coming out in the news. A mystery revolves around the sun. A 10th planet. Something is there. So this information has been reinvigorated in the last decade or so. And it is interesting to note that it is directly in alignment with what we have about the ancient Nibiru. So if we do find a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, some interesting things might happen. Now, there is other information to support the idea of a large planet or some type of second sun being attached to our solar system. Now, one of the ideas that we have is that there was a large and extinction level event that was caused by a massive asteroid or comet impact in the past. The main proponent of this is called the Nemesis theory. This gentleman, Dr. Richard Mueller, who is a physicist at Berkeley, proposed the idea that, you can see here, that there is a large orbital planet that he calls Nemesis, and it orbits well into what is this debris field you'd see here is called the Oort cloud. So it's a scientific known fact that our solar system, billions of miles out from it, has another asteroid belt called the Oort cloud. And there's all kinds of floating debris and just comets and asteroids that they think generate from this Oort cloud and are periodically brought to the inner part of our solar system. How? One of the ideas put forth is that there's this Nemesis planet, a large planet on an orbit that takes it through the inner part of our solar system and well out into the Oort cloud, where it would pick up debris, and the gravitational effects of going through such a large asteroid field, well, it's going to bring it along with it to the inner part of the solar system. And so that brings an interesting model in the idea that a lot of these things that we see floating out there in space could possibly, if they are a part of our solar system, let's say, a planet X, it's also going to be bringing debris along with it. So one of the ideas for Dr. Mueller's theory is that there is a second sun, and that Nemesis actually is orbiting not around our sun, but two suns. And that's why it's very difficult for us to detect this planet. But Dr. Mueller is actually hitting on 2 points that I want to stress here. One, of course, is Nibiru and Planet X, the main focus of this lesson. But the other one is the idea that we have a second sun. Okay? Over 30 cultures reference the fact that we have two suns. There was a very high esoteric knowledge book written called Hamlet's Mill. I have yet to own a copy. It's well out of print. But it documents over 30 ancient cultures were aware of us having two suns, and that the orbit of these two suns, the suns being at their farthest point or the suns being at their closest point, have an impact on the rise and fall of civilization here on Earth. When the two suns are at their closest point, we're in the Golden Age. Everyone's heard of the Golden Age. When the suns are at their farthest point from each other, we're in the Dark Ages. And this seems to repeat here over and over on Earth in a large 24,000-year cycle. Now, right now, that scientific term is called the precession of the equinox. We've divided the heavens into 12 parts, 12 constellations, 12 different zodiacal symbols. Again, the breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts was first given to us by the Sumerian culture, who say that they were taught this by the Anunnaki. And where do the Anunnaki come from? The 12th planet. 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year, 12 inches in a foot, coming from the 12th planet. So it's very interesting that we have to understand that there is a lot of scientific crossover for the idea that, one, we have two suns, but that for today's focus, that there is the possibility of a planet X looping around our second sun, having a 3,600-year orbit, and making that a scientific possibility. So I think it is interesting to note that this lost cycle of time, talking about the idea that we have two suns, is an interesting model that does collaborate and help put into existence the idea of a Nibiru. Nibiru can't orbit, billions of miles out into deep space without having some other source to be looping back around. So all of our current science is showing we're probably a binary solar system. Most of the solar systems that we film externally from Mars with Hubble and Spitzer and various other telescopes, we see that they're in this intricate dance. Two suns, 4, 6, sometimes even more, all in an amazing orbit around each other. Suns in orbit around each other. So it's very possible we are in fact binary. Folks, this changes the whole game. If we can prove that we're a binary solar system, we have to understand that if our sun is orbiting a second sun, binary, meaning the two suns are in orbit, right? This is heavy. If our sun is orbiting a second sun over a very large cycle of time, we in fact are moving through space with our sun. If our sun is orbiting another sun while we're going around our sun, we're moving along through space with it. That changes the whole perspective of how our current sciences observe the precession of the equinox. It's this lunar solar theory where they think there's a wobble in our Earth that degrades the orbit over 72 years by 1 degree. It's a very inaccurate model of our current precession of the equinox. The new model, put forth and looked at by the Binary Research Institute and many other scholars studying this idea that there is this ancient cycle The ancient Hindus and Indians called this the yugas, the cycle of the great year. Even Plato called it the great year. So there were many cultures, in fact, over 30 ancient cultures were aware of this binary orbit and said that's what controlled this larger cycle of time. Just like the Mayan calendar was a much larger cycle of time, awareness of a much larger cycle of time. They're speaking about this information, the binary orbit of our two suns. That's why we go through every 2,000 years a new zodiacal symbol. Right now we're in the age of Pisces, that symbol of a fish. You might even see that symbol of a fish on someone's card. What they think they're symbolizing is Jesus. Well, that's been a symbol around well before Jesus as the age of Pisces, an astronomical marker. And very soon, in about 150 years, we're going to go into the age of Aquarius. So we're at a precipice, a point of change, where we're coming out of the Dark Ages and going towards the Golden Age once again. Unfortunately, we're very far away from the Golden Age, but I think everyone can feel that change is happening. Our sciences and knowledge is exponentially increasing. Here again, evidence of two suns. This is the famous Tower of Babel, right? Building a tower to get to the heavens, where there are two suns. Many ancient cultures knew this information as a fact. We are now relearning this information. So the whole idea of a Nibiru makes an interesting correlation to the idea that it would be going around two suns. Now, this cycle of the great year, again, is spoken about by many ancient cultures. And the ancient Vedic texts and the Hindu scriptures are the ones of most interest to me right now, because I too want to learn. And this information, again, is thousands of years into our past, shared by each culture. And probably the reason why various megalithic monuments are built to align to constellations in the sky that repeat. It's a marker in time to say where they were in this larger celestial clock. So we have to understand, just as a simple analogy, that we only live for about 120 years if we're lucky. Based on our current sciences, things are going to change in our lifetime, and we're going to have longer lifespans. 120 years is probably reasonable. But if you think about that in the scale of 24,000 years, what's 120 years? It's a blip on the map. Here's an insect that we can put into perspective so that we understand these 24,000 year cycles affect humanity. How do we put that into perspective? This insect only lives 24 hours. So the mayfly, let's say another mayfly comes up to this one and it's a cloudy day and there's no wind or sunshine. And the mayfly says to the other one, I've heard this rumor of the sun and heat and breeze and wind, but I don't see it. And then they die 24 hours later. Just because that day it wasn't sunny or there wasn't a breeze doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that's exactly the perils that we have now in understanding what the ancients have been telling us, and went to great lengths to mark why there is this large cycle of time. Folks, it seems that the orbit of our two suns have an effect on us. And when our suns are at their closest point, the energy of our suns, or something happens where we go into a golden age. Our brains and our ability to evolve goes into an exponential state of growth. And at that point, of course, we're interacting with aliens and higher life forms and interdimensional beings, what have you. Right now, we don't have that capability. Those interactions are limited. We are relearning this information. So just understand that when you look up in the heavens and look at the night sky, the breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts by the ancients is something that was done for a reason. This sacred knowledge has been encoded into monuments all over the earth to track where they were in this cycle of time. Even the ancient Sumerians had these, astronomical symbols of various zodiacal references that they put on sacred art and precious stones. So I think it's interesting to note that various things that they were marking as times and place of events that took place in the past weren't always because it was the gods were here. Maybe there were also catastrophic events and pinpointed events in time in our past that could possibly happen again. Planets orbit, seasons change, everything is cyclical. If an asteroid or a comet has struck the Earth in the past, maybe this happens over thousands of years, and there are preordained times that we need to learn and understand these patterns. Now, in my lifetime, just about a decade ago, there were, Shoemaker-Levy 9. We had a large comet that broke up into 9 pieces and impacted Jupiter in such a way that just these spots alone could fit 4 to 8 Earths, about the size of Nibiru, right inside of Jupiter. When this impact took place, NASA said, you know what? There's not going to be really anything to see. Shoemaker-Levy 9 is going to break up into some fragments and hit Jupiter. It won't be anything big. No big deal. No big deal. Talk about a solar system event. Again, the fragmentation of when it hit Jupiter left scars 4 to 8 times the size of Earth with each of these locations. I'd say that's a pretty big deal. Okay? So there have been things that happened in our solar system in the past that we can track with our sciences. We should definitely pay attention for God forbid something happens within our own lifetime. Now, we do not have enough of a tracking program currently tracking what potentially could happen. Our near-Earth asteroid program is well underfunded. But having said that, I do think that there is another layer of protection by the Anunnaki or by the ancient beings, these gods that have protected us and been with and helped and pushed our civilizations along. I don't think that they would allow another major extinction level event on our current path. But I don't know. So it is very interesting, I think, to pay attention to some of these stories and things in the past, because as you can see, if you Google Planet X right now on the internet, there are people claiming to take pictures of Planet X by the sun with their webcam, or they see something that they think is the Planet X that's been sitting in the same spot for months. That doesn't happen. So we have to understand that there is a very large astronomical community of amateur astronomers all over the Earth, and anything that we've ever seen, Hale-Bopp, Shoemaker-Levy 9, as I just showed you, these were all first seen by amateur astronomers and then escalated to the professional community. I guarantee you, if we ever see a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, anywhere near the inner part of our solar system, meaning on a trajectory that will bring it near us, we're going to probably see it years out. Now, that's not to say that we don't already know where Nibiru is and are not privately calculating when it will return, and maybe something bad will happen. I really don't know. And I guarantee you, folks, as honest as I'm being with you with my resources and knowledge, anyone else writing a book or telling you in their lecture that they know when Nibiru is going to return, they are not telling you the truth. Our sciences will be able to detect this planet if it does exist. So keep your eyes peeled to the sky and pay attention to what we're doing with our space sciences. All right, folks, thank you again, and stay tuned for next